Grouping our application's functionality into modules is strongly recommended as an effective way to organize our components. For most applications, the resulting architecture will employ multiple modules, each encapsulating a closely related set of capabilities. Because of this encapsulated organization, this allows us to test each feature independently by importing a specific module that we want to test into our testing module. In this lesson, we'll be testing the coffees feature we worked on throughout this course and test some of the CRUD endpoints we provided in it so far. To get started, let's create a new folder within our test directory named Coffee. Within this folder, let's create a single end-to-end test file named coffees.e2e-spec.ts. Inside this file, let's start by creating the basic structure for our test. As we can see, we have a top-level describe block again, which represents our test suite. Within this block, we have the before all and after all hooks again, representing the setup and teardown phases of our tests. And lastly, within our testing modules imports array, we're passing in coffees module this time. We haven't implemented any tests yet, so let's add a few placeholders and we'll work our way through these in a few moments. With these it.todo reminders in place, we won't forget to cover all the important scenarios later. To-do, provided by Jest, is a great way to track tests that need to be completed in the future, as they even show up in the Jest report to help remind you. Alright, so let's run this particular test and see if any errors pop up. Open up the terminal and let's enter in the npm run test e2e command again, but passing in the -- flag with coffees after it. It looks like we're getting an error, but we've seen this one a few times now. It's the nest cannot resolve dependencies error. If we look at the error description, we can see that the connection provider is missing. Since our application uses a database as a data source, and we leverage repository classes heavily within the coffees module scope, the testing module cannot properly bootstrap. So how can we fix this? Well, there are many different approaches to tackle this issue. The first option we have is to mock interactions with the database. We could override all the providers and replace them with mocked objects, stubbing methods, and manipulating the returned values. This does give us full flexibility and isolation, but as for a con to this approach, it's time-consuming, very error-prone, and hard to maintain, plus we can't test any interaction with a real database or test any plain SQL queries. Another option is to use disk-based databases, for example, SQLite. With this approach, we don't have to mock anything or stub on any methods. It's easier to maintain and doesn't add any complexity or overhead. It's fast and easy to set up. However, it works for simple scenarios when we don't use any database management system specific features, such as Postgres-related features in this case. Some queries might fail for Postgres, but not for SQLite. We don't really test the entire flow. And one other option we have is to add an additional testing database. This way we don't have to mock anything or stub on any methods. It's easier to maintain and we use the same database, for example Postgres in our case, so our end-to-end test will have the same flow as our real application does. Some cons to this approach: it does add more complexity and overhead since we need to start and close the database for end-to-end tests, both locally and in the CI/CD pipeline if we have one. Note that deciding which approach to use heavily depends on your application's requirements. In this lesson, we'll be going with the third approach as it's the most reliable way to do a real-world test of our features using the same type of database. The additional complexity and overhead is not a big issue since we're already using Docker in our application. Alright, so let's get this set up by opening up our Docker Compose file and add another database in there. We're going to use the same configuration options as for the original database, with one minor difference. We need to make sure that our ports aren't in conflict. So we're mapping port 5432 to the port of 5433 here instead. With this in place, let's open up our package.json file and define pre and post hooks for our test end-to-end script to make our lives easier and somewhat automate this process. If you're not familiar with these hooks, npm scripts allow us to add lifecycle hooks to our scripts simply by prepending pre or post to a similarly named script. With these npm lifecycle hooks set up, our database will be automatically started before running end-to-end tests and closed right afterwards. Lastly, let's head back to our coffees end-to-end spec file and import the typeorm module.forRoot to initialize a connection to this new testing database we just created. Note the different port of 5433 being used here. Now, if we open up the terminal and run npm run test :e2e --coffees command again, as we can see, this time there are no errors. We can also see that the database container was created before running the tests and was closed immediately after they completed. Great! With this setup, we're ready to start implementing our actual test logic, which we'll do in the next lesson. We did a lot in this video. To summarize, we created a new test for just our coffees module, created a new test database in our Docker Compose file, and even added some cool npm hooks to help start and close our database whenever our tests run. With a lot of this in place, we're fully ready to handle end-to-end tests for our application as it continues to grow in the future.